Welcome to citiesabc.com, series of interviews and profiles with global top thought leaders, experts, and people shaping and creating new narratives for our world, society, business, and industries. My name is Dinis Guarda, and this is my podcast, and as well a platform where we are hosting and welcoming big minds and big spirits and authors that are talking about the biggest problems, questions, and challenges humanity is facing, and how we can think bigger and out of the box to find the best solutions and the best ideas to solve these problems. citiesabc.com is a new wiki for AR intelligent smart cities tech digital platform for reinventing and uniting cities, universities, and all of us, the citizens. Today, we have with us Randall Bolten, that is an author and finance executive. Randall Bolten has over 30 years experience in high-tech companies in Silicon Valley, and including 20 years as CFO for both public companies and venture-backed private companies, including IPO and several other public transactions. Randall Bolten recently authored the new book, Painting with Numbers, presenting financials and other numbers so people will understand you. I think this is a particularly important topic for our times. Welcome to our podcast, Randall. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Dinis, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be included in your list of interviewees.
Thank you so much. So, Randall, I'm particularly interested in your experience and trajectory, and I think we need more and more wisdom and as well people that have experience in building things, not in destroying, because it's very easy to destroy, but it's difficult to construct. And as well, especially at these times, we need more than ever to construct and build new narratives and new stories. So I would like to start with your history. I know that you are an American from different areas, from Washington. So could you tell us a bit about your background, a bit of introduction, education, overview?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I'm, first of all, unusual even in the United States. I'm a native of Washington, D.C. I grew up inside the city line. Other than a few years in my early childhood in Germany, where my father was in the Central Intelligence Agency and stationed in Germany in the 1950s, I spent my entire youth in Washington, D.C. I went to Princeton University as an undergraduate, studied economics with some additional emphasis on applied mathematics back in the days when that meant learning how to write programs in Fortran, and then went out west to Stanford Business School. For a couple of years after graduation, I worked as a consultant and then concluded I just wanted to be near where things were actually happening instead of writing studies about what might be happening. And I joined a company called Tandem Computers, which was one of the early hot stories. In fact, Tandem Computers was the first successful investment that a venture company called Kleiner Perkins Caulfield and Byers. It was Kleiner Perkins' first investment success in the 70s and 80s. And I had a series of finance jobs. I started in the Treasury, which is a good place for people who don't have necessarily much accounting experience. To go into the Treasury, especially on the West Coast, one of the principal skills is being able to get up early enough to do the investing because the markets open at 6 o'clock on the West Coast, well, 6:30. But I worked at Tandem Computers for 7 years. And then for the next 3 years, in the late 80s, I was the corporate controller at Oracle, right after it had gone public, and grew in those 3 years from $50 to $500 million. And that was a remarkable experience. I think anybody who worked for Larry Ellison will say that their experience was a remarkable experience. I found it very interesting and very enjoyable. But the main takeaway for me from having worked at Oracle was that at Oracle, I was the alpha user of Oracle Financials, which was the first financial accounting system based on a relational database. And that was a profound change in the way the financial information was recorded. And among other things, it was a profound change in the way you could get information out of an accounting system. After my time at Oracle, and since then, I've been a CFO for now nearly 30 years, and at a variety of companies. One of them that you mentioned, the growth, was Broadvision. I joined Broadvision when it was 24 employees and no revenues, and was there for 6 years until the time it had about 3,600 employees and over $500 million in annual revenue. We took that company public and had several stock offerings after that. Since then, I've been the CFO of several other software companies. And as Dinis, as you mentioned earlier, a few years ago, one of the passions, and perhaps you can infer that from my description of my experience at Oracle, one of my passions is not just looking at the numbers, but presenting the numbers in a way that people actually can understand them. And I view it fundamentally as a communication skill. And that's what motivated me to write Painting with Numbers. And so over the last 6 or 8 years, I've been a CFO, mostly on a contract basis. I'm involved in an interesting startup I'll talk about in just a second. But I've been involved as a CFO, as I said, mostly on a contract basis, and also involved in specific CFO type projects. Another interest of mine is designing incentive compensation plans that actually make sense, that don't create fratricidal incentives within a company, and so on. But also, as a result of having published the book, I've done a fair amount of writing and speaking and teaching. As you mentioned, I teach a class at Berkeley called Presenting Quantitative Data Effectively. I've also taught a course like that for a few years at the University of Coburg in the MBA program in Germany. So that brings us up to the present. I'm currently involved in a startup. It's very, very early. In another medical issue that's gotten a lot of, involved in another medical issue that's gotten a lot of press lately, a little bit less during the pandemic, but it's the opioid crisis. And it's a software company whose goal is to make life easier and more efficient for doctors who prescribe controlled substances. And if you like, we can spend a little bit of time talking about that in the course of this conversation. Again, one of the things it relates to is is producing information for people who have to make a living making intelligent decisions about the information they're getting.
Fantastic. So Randall, it's really an impressive CV, and as well, for instance, just the experience of Oracle would be probably the context for a great interview. So I would like to go through this experience working with some of the leading tech companies in the world, and as well looking at the difference, and as well, for instance, 30 years, a lot of things change in terms of the way you look at technology, to look at maths and finance, and as well even databases, because I'm sure that 30 years ago, looking at the way you just report the numbers is completely different from what we have now. So in this, let's start by this, because I think this is particularly important to see the way you see the evolution, and as well still involving startups, which is great. How do you see the evolution, first of all, of the financial kind of numbering part of the businesses, which you've been working, but as well the evolution to use much more software and much more different things. So do you think we change, we evolve a lot? And as well, there was a democratization of the concept of startup, the concept of tech company, and tech became actually mainstream. But I would like to hear your opinion on that area.
Well, as the lawyers would say, that's a compound question.
It is.
But that's okay. It gives me an opportunity to talk about how information has changed in the last 30 years. Like I said, Oracle's introduced a revolution that's not really that well understood. But 30 or 40 years ago or more, it was incredibly difficult to produce the numbers. And it took armies of people with calculators to produce financials, and it took so much time and effort to produce that it was really hard for anybody to take additional time to do any analysis on the numbers. I know you've interviewed people who are professors of business analytics and that sort of thing. And those capabilities weren't possible. The mathematics was there 30 or 40 years ago. The statistical knowledge was there, but there just wasn't the bandwidth in a finance organization to make sense of the numbers. And one of the things you'll see, and this is an ongoing trend, and it's going to continue, is that the distribution of people in the finance function is shifting from accounting and from treasury into what's called FP&A, financial planning and analysis. And this is a decentralized focus. The FP&A people don't necessarily report in a decentralized way. Often they're part of the CFO organization, just as they've always been. But physically and emotionally, they support line functions like sales and manufacturing and marketing. And they are often becoming one of the right-hand support people for a line manager, because there's so much data and it's so easy to download the data and collect it that managers can behave in a data-driven way. But at the same time, there are issues with that. One of them, and one of the interviews I watched before we got on this call this morning was with the business analytics chairman at I think it's the University of Glasgow, I believe, or a Scottish professor.
Edinburgh, yeah.
And it's remarkable that some of the logic that you have to use hasn't changed. We'll talk about this in the questions you asked me to consider, the future of education. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm a little bit of a traditionalist. And there are two things that I think even finance professionals who are awash in data, who have lots of powerful software to collect data, to analyze it, to present information, there are two sets of skills that are critically important for doing this. And I would say even more important now that we have so much data. And one of them is statistics. It's just a basic understanding of how you make inferences from numbers, thinking statistically. And another reason that's important now is because we live in riskier times. And when you live in riskier times, you need to focus not only on what's happening and what you think is going to happen, but what's the variation around that? What is the range of the upside and the downside? So that's one of the areas I mentioned is statistics. And statistical inference is becoming more and more important when we have so much data. The second thing is fundamental communication skills. And this has been an ongoing trend as more and more functions are online, as more and more people who do financial support are out near the line organizations. But it's even truer now when we're all isolated and everybody's working, well, not everybody, but everybody who physically can is working from their home. There's simply, as far as making yourself understood, there's simply no substitute for being in the same room with people you're talking to. And one of the things I think is a little bit tragic, well, there's a lot that's tragic about the pandemic, but one of the things that people don't always talk about is the fact that people are not communicating in the same physical location nearly as much. And I don't think you can overstate the significance of that issue and that change. But when you're in the same room with a person and that person doesn't understand what you're saying, he can sort of look at you and form an inference about whether you're serious or not, whether you think whether you're advocating an action or arguing against an action. And if you don't understand, you can say, could you clarify that? And these are things that are much harder to do when you're all on a Zoom conference. And there's no opportunity after the Zoom conference is over, as you're walking out of the room, to say, by the way, you know, in that meeting, when you said thus and so. So, like I said, I'm kind of a traditionalist when it comes to education. And I think the future belongs to people even more than 20 or 30 years ago. The future belongs to people who can make themselves understood and can communicate things in a way that doesn't necessarily turn people off, makes them seem, makes them seem informed and understanding, but not necessarily arrogant and talking down to people. The Silicon Valley was full of people who didn't have much in the way of personality, but were completely brilliant at writing great code or coming up with great marketing ideas. And it's going to be harder when you're distant from people to sell yourself and to make your points well understood. I'm not
it's very good points.
Question there, but
no, I understand. So I would like to touch precisely what you said. I believe and I agree with you that we need the traditionalism side, because there are things that never change, and some of the things is relationships and business network, And as well, like you said, the bases need to be the bases. You're not, I think there was someone, even if you look at Nassim Taleb and the numbers and the importance that I think when it comes to numbers, numbers are numbers. And that's a big challenge in the business, especially in the geopolitical world we're living today. So from an education perspective, you've been, well, been part of some of the leading universities in the world, studying in Princeton and as well teaching in Berkeley. So how do you see the education and what would be like the major, I think, the major summary that you got from your experience and as well career, especially now that I think we are in a phase, and hopefully this won't continue, the social distance won't continue forever because we need to be close to people. But what would be like the major summary points and major conclusions that you got from your experience in education, in finance and in business?
You know, it won't come as a surprise to you that the part of my education that I value the most, strictly about the education, is the places where I learned to write effectively and to speak effectively and to form reasonable and logical conclusions from the numbers. And that's going to continue to be true. Well, let me make sort of a political statement. I don't know what this is not such an issue outside the US, but in the US, perhaps you've read that there are an immense number of young adults who are horribly burdened by the debt they've incurred for going to college. And they're not making enough money to pay off that debt. And there's a lot of discussion about what to do about that, including people on the left wing who are saying there should be college debt forgiveness. We have to forgive all this college debt. The problem is that people haven't necessarily asked themselves, why is it that these poor young people can't pay off the debt? And part of the problem is because what they learned in college didn't earn them enough more money compared to not going to college to enable them to pay off that debt. And that speaks to what academics needs to do for people to make them successful in their careers. And I think where we're headed here, especially because technology changes so much, the rules change so much, that one of the things I think we have to do is focus traditional education on the basics and spend perhaps less time requiring people to go to college and spending more time getting short ad hoc training in the skills they need to learn right now as things move forward. And even in finance, which you would think was kind of an intellectually stable functional area, leaving aside the focus on more and more data. But the accounting rules are changing so fast that, 40 years ago, you could be an accounting major in college and maybe even go get a master's in accounting, and you would know enough accounting to be successful in your career as a CPA. And that's not true anymore because the rules keep changing and because the rules are different and because reporting requirements of software companies are different from medical device companies, are different from fast food chains. And so really what you need is the basics. And then as you're out there and you go to work for an accounting firm and you start auditing, say, food companies or software companies, you need specialized training on on a more ad hoc basis to help you do that. And I think that's true in all kinds of technical areas. You know, they said, somebody once said to me that in the 1600s, Sir Isaac Newton knew everything that mankind knew. Every piece of information that mankind had could be known by a single person, like Galileo or Sir Isaac Newton. And we've gotten way away from that. It's just not possible anymore. And you have to be able to say, I don't know.
Yeah, and that is a very important thing. I think from leadership and from a education perspective, the capacity of humility and the capacity to learn, but as well to listen. And I think that's very important. And that's why I love to hear people like you with your experience, but as well with the dignity that comes with that. So from your experience with Berkeley and as well in the academic world, what would be let's say you've been teaching a lot of people and passing through a lot of things, and then you have as well the experience as CFO and working with big corporations and as well with startups. So how do you see this trajectory? Because for instance, one of the things that, and probably this is another complex question, but I would like to hear is that one of the things I've been finding is that I used to be a huge fan of Silicon Valley, but now and being here in London, UK, but as well, I feel that Silicon Valley partly failures. It's not the worst. There's a lot of great things that came out of that, but it became probably a kind of a self-centered organization that doesn't really create anymore and is losing part of control of the rest of the world. If you look at what is happening in Asia, in Africa, there's much more innovation coming out of there right now. And as well, there's a lot of challenge on that level. So there's a kind of a reaffirmation and re-engineering of the world innovation decentralized systems right now, but as well the way we look at education as well. So from being in a leading university and teaching as well finance, how do you see this as well, and what's your opinion on all of these topics?
You know, I think what you're describing is accurate, that there are plenty of Silicon Valleys in the world. I think Silicon Valley, the people who were in Silicon Valley 30 or 40 years ago, or who came to Silicon Valley 30 or 40 years ago, should pat themselves on the back for having created a new approach to business. And it's an approach that's taking hold in London, in Boston, in the Far East, and mostly that's a good thing. And the idea that it was going to go on forever and be centralized in Silicon Valley was an unachievable dream. But like I said, I think that's a good thing. We're seeing, you know, I'm involved in a small company here in Washington right now. It's called Spiritualate. You won't have heard of it, but it's a couple of guys, and one of them is an MD who's a pain specialist, and he's become increasingly frustrated. The U.S. has one of the worst opioid crises in the world, but opioids are a problem worldwide, and controlled substances are a further problem. It's not just opioids, but the next prescription drug problem that the world is going to face is Adderall, and the one that there are some epidemiologists who worry about the most is the worldwide overprescription of antibiotics, which is going to create strains of diseases that are resistant to antibiotics. So any kind of software that makes it easier for doctors to more safely and efficiently prescribe controlled substances is immensely valuable. And I know I've sort of gone afield with this one, but I want to come back to the point that this company could be founded by two people. One guy who's a doctor who specializes in pain medication and has seen how hard it is to prescribe controlled substances, and the other one is a very experienced IT consulting professional. As it happens, both of them were born in India but have lived in the US. But the point is, the point I want to come back to is that this business can be created anywhere and doesn't have to be in Silicon Valley. It may be that we'll go to Silicon Valley when the time comes to raise funding for this business. But with technology, especially powerful software technology, regardless of what the software is used for, it's a business that can be started anywhere. That's one of the best things that's happened in the world in the last 30 or 40 years. And a lot of it is because of technology that's pretty invisible to us, a little bit like Zoom, for example.
No, completely. So I wanna keeping on that level, and I think so. Coming right now from your experience as CFO again. So one of the things you touched when you mentioned about Oracle and some the other companies that you took over, and as well that you initially start looking at the numbers and as well the role of CFO. So the role of CFO is probably after the CEO the most important role in any company, and as well even
thank you for saying
I would say no, I think it's a fact. In some cases the CFO is as important as the CEO and the CTO. Of course right now we need to have technology, but from that experience leading big companies like you, public companies and private companies, what would be your biggest advice for companies listening to us and for potential people that want to go into the industry, or as well even present CEOs and CTOs and CFOs that are listening to us? Because I think experience is very important and the devil's of details. And I think for, let's say, for each very successful company, there's probably hundreds of companies that are failing.
I would say so, yeah.
We only see normally the success in one thing that happened. Yeah, so I think that I'm particularly interested in that experience, and as well you're still active when you could probably be relaxing, which I admire as well. So just giving a bit of an overview on that area and that kind of the things that the traditionalism part in a good way that you consider the most important areas for that.
Well, to some extent, again, I'll come back to my traditionalist view, which is that it's kind of a shame that the term CEO was taken already to mean Chief Executive Officer, because I'll interpret your question as asking me what's important for CFOs, and I like to think of the CFO as the chief explaining officer. That one reason you made that flattering, but I think honest comment about CFOs in many companies being the most important person in the company after the CEO is because rather than thinking about the CFO job as being about managing money and cash and that sort of thing, and all of those things are important, but as we sometimes say, we have people for that sort of thing. The CFO's principal job is just making sense of the business to everybody. One of the things that I really enjoy doing, and I think it's a useful skill that I bring to this company where I'm working right now called Scripturate, is simply a sense of why the enterprise is there and how you explain it to people. So, for example, a good CFO is the person who really is responsible for helping construct the investment pitch that the company has. Especially when you have a founder who may be technically very astute, but is very wrapped up in how wonderful the technology is, and not necessarily in what problem that technology is solving, even though he or she intuitively understands there's a problem to be solved. But a good CFO can also help in helping salespeople craft a value proposition for customers, and in the case, for example, of Scriptulate, in getting involved in what the user interface looks like for an MD who's using the software in a way that helps him quickly understand whether prescribing a certain drug is going to be risky for this particular patient. In other words, there's kind of a blurring of the lines between functions, and one of the reasons that's happened is because of all this access to data and the need to make sense of the data. So if there was one thing that I would say, if you're asking me for career advice for somebody who's in the finance profession, is in addition to developing a strong understanding of the underlying business, think in terms of how that understanding gets presented to lots of different people, to people inside the company who are technically skilled, to potential customers who are thinking about buying the product, to investors who are trying to understand what the future potential of the company is. But in every one of those situations, it's an explaining challenge.
Very interesting. So, speaking right now in terms of, we've been going through your experience as CFO and the different areas. So you've been just looking at some of the things that are particularly interesting. We've been right now with Lucidity, that is your contract CFO company. And this is, I want to touch a bit to this, the CFO as a contractor. And this is an area that is becoming very important for startups. And I don't know how we're working with this new startup over there in Washington, but it's a very interesting thing for the future, is that we are tending to see the future of work less as a continuation of a linear work, but working with different collaboration and people that come and work. And as well, you have a huge experience in consultancy. So how do you see this angle between the consultancy, between being part of a company and creating in a company, and being in and out? Because that's a very important thing. And I think it's something not everyone can actually work in. And I think the COVID-19 is highlighting this need of having much more collaboration digitally. And you touch that from Zoom to other things, but as well, it's very complex and very difficult. So being someone that has been working as contractor, as consultant, but as well as CFO, you've been having the two roles, being within a company, outside of a company, coming in and out, and as well reflecting that as a teacher. So how do you see this part? It's particularly interesting, I think, for everyone in business in the world.
Well, and you're going to see more and more of it. It's, you know, one of the things, I'll make sort of a social comment before I answer your question more directly, is that the laws in some countries make it difficult to be a contractor compared to an employee. You know, for example, in the US, when it comes to being able to carry your health insurance from one place of work to another, for example, that one of the things that countries need to recognize is an increasing focus on what sometimes is called the gig economy. but at the same time, there's no question that this trend toward contract people, especially in fairly skilled jobs, and jobs that don't necessarily require constant physical presence, like being a CFO, that there's no question that you're going to see more and more of that. And in some ways, that's a good thing, because here I am, this startup I just described, Scriptulate, it's two guys who have been able to convince some of their friends to develop software at somewhat lower rates for a few months until the company gets funding. And they need somebody with my skills, or with the skills of someone like me, to help them develop an approach to pricing, and to create a business model, and to create an investor pitch, and to have somebody who's got, well, I was going to say have some gray hairs, but white hairs will do as well. But to have somebody who, in a senior way, presents the company credibly, but they don't really need that much, at least in the very, very early stages. So you're going to see more and more of this. And especially, to come back to a topic we touched on earlier in this conversation, that the particular skills that you need at any given time are very specialized, and you may not need it. You may only need one person for 3 months with this particular knowledge of, for example, let's say with Scriptulate, interfacing Scriptulate software with the EMR systems, these big ticket health information systems that cost hospitals billions of dollars to implement. And for a while, you need somebody who knows how to interface the software you're developing with this EMR system. And then you don't need that person again for many more months. And you're going to see more and more of that.
So that is a big challenge as well, though, because one of the things as a teacher, so I think we are prepared for that because we have quite a big education and stuff. But for someone young, like you said, there's a huge depth, and there's a huge as well challenge in the sense of stability, both psychological and work stability. So this creates the gig economy that we're not preparing people for this in universities. At least most of the universities have been. How do you deal with that? I would like to have your opinion, especially teaching at Berkeley, because I completely agree with you with everything, but I'm just trying to look at both as a teacher as well as CFO. How do you see this angle?
This is a challenge. I would say that at least from what I've seen, I have two daughters who are 28 and 32, and they're in their own way part of this gig economy. I would say that they're adjusting to that, and in fact they're handling it better than I or my peers would be handling it. I think one of the things that has to happen is that public policy needs to recognize that this is the direction in the future. So, for example, and again, this is an issue that's a big issue in the U.S., and I think much less of an issue in most of the other wealthy countries in the world. But for example, this issue of how do you get health insurance, and then how do you keep it, especially with the cost of healthcare going up and up and up. But there are policies that governments in the U.S. it's important both at the federal and at the state level. There are policy changes that need to be designed to address this greater approach toward temporary employment and toward contractors and that kind of thing. And another one is making it easier making it easier for young people to create savings plans that enable them to have a cushion 20 or 30 or 40 years out in the future. And promoting that kind of approach. So I think people figure this kind of thing out on their own, and what we need is public policies that support that approach. I think, my sense is that young professionals are doing a pretty good job of adjusting to this economy. It's us older people that aren't doing such a good job.
Yeah, it's a good point. So I think in terms of now coming back to your book, so painting with numbers, presenting financials and other numbers so people will understand you. I think this is a very good title and very important, I think, especially for our politicians and for our leaders, because it seems like they don't know much about numbers. But I would like not go into politics, but just in terms of the book in itself. Can you tell us about the book, about why you wrote this book, and as well this title that is very clear about what it means?
Well, throughout my career, I saw lots and lots of situations where the problem simply was where little changes in the way numerical information could be presented would make a huge difference in how well that information was understood. And one of the things that I've always found most flattering is somebody saying, I've been getting these reports for years, and now I understand them. And all I did was make a few changes to the way the report was laid out, presented fewer digits, changed the formatting a little, rearranged a column, little things that made the information actually accessible to somebody who wasn't necessarily a finance professional. And as far as I'm concerned, presenting numerical information effectively is not a math skill, it's a communication skill, and people forget that. So painting with numbers starts with why we justify a column of numbers in a spreadsheet. There's a good reason for doing that, and not justifying your numbers is a deadly sin of presenting those numbers. And we move on from there into, for example, using white space effectively when you present a report. The way numbers are visually organized on a sheet of paper is the numbers presentation equivalent of paragraphs in writing. Just imagine if you get a 5-page memo that was one single paragraph. What would your reaction be if you got a memo like that? That was just one paragraph, had no paragraph breaks. You'd look at that and say, I'm not going to understand this document. Paragraphs calm the reader down. White space organizes information so that you can separate out the revenues from the expenses, for example. And it goes on from there to think about things like, we talked about this at the very beginning of the conversation. There are a lot of numbers that have been thrown around about, we're about to have, I think today actually, it's tragic since it's Memorial Day that we're doing this interview. The US is going to cross the 100,000 death threshold from COVID. And our president brags about how we have performed 14 million tests, and that's more than any other country. And part of the reason we've done that is because we have more people than any other country, except for two, China and India. So to perform 14 million tests is not particularly impressive when a country, 1/5 your size, has performed 10 million tests. So another important aspect of presenting numbers effectively is using ratios effectively. And I know this sounds way down in the weeds, but key indicators, or KPIs, are a critical element of presenting quantitative information effectively. And another area where this distinction is really important is one of the huge buzzwords in numbers presentation today is, and I'm sure you've used this term and heard it lots, is data visualization. And that means graphing numbers. And the problem with that is not every issue lends itself to a graphical presentation of the numbers. And data visualization is something that happens even at a table of numbers. When people are using boldface to emphasize the most important numbers, when they're using white space, when they're using colors. So all of these things may seem mundane, but they're especially important, to come back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation. They're especially important when you and the people that you provide a service to are just awash in data, that it becomes even more important to find a way to make sure that that information is comprehensible and that there is actually a message involved in what you're saying. So that's what painting with numbers is about. And sadly, many people who present information, and I kind of hold the accounting profession responsible for this flaw, is that they tend to assume that if the numbers are correct, they've done their job, and that's just not true.
So you touch on
when it's understood.
Completely, and I think it's a very important point, and me as well, and I think everyone is increasing more dependent of numbers. So on the data visualization that you touch, and how do you see this painting with numbers? And as well, for instance, like you said, the way you present the numbers can make a company get funding, can make a company go bankrupt, or can make a company just make a leapfrog in terms of sales or business development, like you mentioned as well. So how do you look, what is this part in terms of, on a pragmatic level from your experience as a CFO, how these numbers can be approached in a very practical way? As the formula is something that you want to highlight with the book, but as well some metrics that you think are really important?
I wouldn't necessarily say there's any single metric that's critically important. The important thing when you're presenting metrics is to show that you've thought about the problem and you've been able to boil down that issue into a relatively small set of numbers. Let me use an investor pitch as an example. One of the slides in every investor pitch is the business model. It's the 5-year outlook of revenues and expenses and profitability. And frankly, anybody can produce a spreadsheet that shows that in 5 years, your startup will be a $300 million company with 80% profit margins. That's just a spreadsheet exercise. What's important when you're presenting that business model to somebody, and the people in your audience know that that's just a spreadsheet exercise. What is important is if you present that information in a way that shows that you have an understanding of how that business makes money, of why people buy the product, and what it costs to deliver that product. So it's not the raw numbers themselves necessarily, it's the thought behind the raw numbers. So for example, if you, in your business model you show, say Scripture shows, that we're going to sign up 5,000 doctors this year and 20,000 doctors next year. And we can show people that that is a relatively small percentage of the doctors who prescribe controlled substances, and provide a little bit of thought on how we are going to get to those doctors, and give the people in the audience a sense of what this software is worth to one doctor. Is it worth $1,000 a year to pay for this software, or $2,000 a year? If you can do that, then you've actually used the business model to help people in your audience understand why you're going to succeed.
Very interesting. And so one of the things you did recently, a research note about COVID-19 testing update, COVID-19 testing research. Can you tell us about that? And I think that's particularly interesting to look at the numbers of COVID-19 in particular as well. We touched that a bit, but understanding from your research, and as well how to put the numbers in perspective. Because for instance, if we pick some of your research, and actually I think governments should be looking at it, probably we could get better results and probably tackle the problem faster. That's as well one of the things about dealing with the numbers properly.
Well, sure, I'm happy to talk about that. It's become a little bit of a passion of mine in the last few weeks. I suspect I'm not the only one. But we talked about testing a little bit earlier. There's no question that testing is critically important. And I'm not an epidemiologist, but I completely understand the point that the more testing you do, the more people you know who have the disease you can identify and quarantine them and get the word to them before they go out and infect other people. So there's no question that testing is important. But one of the questions that's worth asking is, and this was what the article that you're referring to, the research note that I wrote, and thank you for publishing it, is that I was kind of curious about which countries seem to be doing a good job of doing testing. And for that purpose, the issue is not how many tests you're doing. A country of 330 million people like the US should be doing several times more tests than, say, the UK is doing, or Italy, or Spain. We have 7 times the population of Spain. But the second thing, and this starts to be where you make sense of the data, is that part of the problem is that having cases drives tests. Because every time you have somebody who gets sick, you gave him a test to identify that he's sick, and then you do 2 or 3 more tests to determine whether he's been cured. In the US, you're not allowed out of quarantine. You're not supposed to be out of quarantine until you test negative 2 times in a row. And probably it creates a demand to test the people really close to you, like your close family members. So some of the tests you're doing, not because you're testing strategically, but simply because you've got a lot of cases. So one direction of causality is that just having cases means you have to do a lot of tests. But there's some causality in the other direction too. Doing a lot of tests weeds out a lot of cases you might not otherwise have known about, because these are people who are asymptomatic or have very mild symptoms, which means they're not really sick. They don't feel ill. They can keep working, but they're contagious. So a second thing that I looked at, so first of all, I created a graph where the main purpose, I have to admit, was partly to show that the US, when you consider per capita testing and the fact that we have a lot of cases, we hadn't really done a very good job of testing our population. But the second thing was, does it really matter? And there you start looking at death rates. And because that, of course, is the main reason you're worried about controlling a pandemic, is simply to minimize the number of deaths. And in that analysis, I created another metric I called strategic testing, which is the total tests a country has done minus the tests that you do just because you have a lot of cases. And I assumed that was 5 tests per case. And when you take out the necessary tests, the 5 tests per case, and include only the tests you do over and above that, there's a fairly clear correlation between countries that are doing a lot of strategic testing and a lower death rate. Sadly, some of the more populous countries are at the wrong end of that spectrum. Countries like the US, Belgium, the UK, that are seeing very high case fatality rates and simply aren't doing that much testing beyond the minimum amount of testing that a country with that many cases needs to do. And I hope that, you know, raises the alarm and gets people to understand that there is nothing more important here. Excuse me for getting on my soapbox, but there's nothing more important here than investing in doing more testing. And frankly, for all of the unemployed people in the Western world right now, hiring many of them as contact tracers would put them to work and be extremely valuable for controlling the pandemic.
And I can.
That was my political statement for the.
No, I subscribe 100%, and I think it's more than political. I think it's a data-driven statement, because whatever the political comes after, but politics come from the word policy, or polis in Greek, and that is city. So I think it's really important. Yeah.
You know, I want to make one sort of political or social statement about this, is that there is so much data flying around that people can focus on pretty much anything to support an argument that they're making. You know, for example, there are people who are saying, excuse me, there are people who are saying that that COVID isn't that serious, that a very high percentage of the population has already been infected, and therefore the death rate isn't really that high. That's not a view I subscribe to, but you know, that's the reason we collect all this information, is to try to understand how lethal COVID is. Because once we understand how lethal it is, we can make intelligent decisions about how risky it is to open up. And unfortunately, this information, you know, tends to be cherry picked. this data tends to be cherry picked, and people are selective about the data that they use to make their points, and they end up reaching wrong conclusions as a result of it. So this is one of the risks of being as awash in data as we are.
So I want to probably to wrap up because we passed already 1 hour. So one thing I would like to ask, precisely picking this last topic, and I think wrapping up with your book as well. So definitely the challenge we have, and it's going to be increasing a bigger challenge, is the way we use data. And data is becoming increasing a weapon for good and for bad. But one thing that for me should be, especially as someone that has been teaching in one of the leading universities in the world, and as well being part of other leading as education, I think there's a responsibility we have as academics and as people that are actually more educated, but as well trying to be more scientific. It's definitely, on that I'm probably more political as well, but I think is in the sense that we cannot just make a statement without doing our homework. At least that's what I try to do with my statements. But you can make statements, you are a CFO, you know how to do numbers, you've been actually having a trajectory that is, but I think right now we have politicians, we have leaders, and we even have a huge amount of things, especially in social networks, people that spend hours and days and years researching things that are completely wrong. So what's your, and I think it's not about liking or not, it's not even political statement, it's not factual, it's not scientific. And I think that's a big problem as we get into artificial intelligence, as we advance more society, how we can cope with this, because we cannot cope with continuously misinformation, and this always happened in history. But right now, like you said, if I use the numbers wrong, I can create an entire kind of a parallel reality with different numbers or fake numbers. And this is happening, unfortunately, it's happening with a lot of stuff. So what's your kind of advice on that? Because it's something that for me makes me create a lot of nightmares, and as well is something that I concern for my children and for the future of our generations.
You know, it concerns me deeply as well. I'm not sure what to say about it, except earlier in our conversation, I stressed the importance of understanding statistics better. And by statistics, I don't mean that you know what an R-squared is or what an exponential smoothing weighted moving average is. That's not what I mean by statistical reasoning. What I mean is how you draw inferences from the numbers. And in particular, the notion that correlation and causation are two different concepts. I mean, what you're describing is the failure of somebody to draw a distinction between correlation and causation. When you have this much data around, you can find two variables that are highly correlated with each other, and they're correlated just by accident because there are so many numbers that it's just not that hard to find. You can flip a coin 10,000 times, and somewhere in there will be a sequence of 10 times where you threw heads consecutively, or 10 times where you threw tails consecutively. It happens. And people need to be more aggressive and more critical, especially people who understand this point that I just made. They need to be more aggressive and more critical about faulty inferences and about people using data. It's not fake data, it's probably valid data, but it's being used in fake ways. And more people who understand these issues need to raise their hands and say that's a fake. That's not clear logic. And eventually, hopefully, this whole issue of fake news and fake data, it's not going away anytime soon. But people need to speak up when they see the difference and when they see there's a problem. So,
No, I think it's a, I subscribe. I don't know if you want to say it, because I subscribe, and I think it's a good way to wrap up. And I think we have a responsibility, all of us, because otherwise we create a very dystopic world where we question everything, and as well, not everyone, let's say someone that is a teacher in a or a researcher or a scientist should have an opinion bigger than someone that just saw a YouTube channel. That's another thing we have to change more in our society. But well, I think there was a bigger topic to go. So I don't know if there's any final statement that you want to talk about the book, or about some of the research you're doing, or even about your startup, just for our audience. We're wrapping up right now.
One of the questions, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed this, and I really appreciate it. As I look back on my career, and I've had an IPO, and I've had other successes, but probably as I look back, the 3 startups that I will have been most proud of having been involved with are medical software startups. One I was involved with a couple of years ago. I'm using machine learning to predict medical outcomes. 25 years ago, I was with a company called BioCAD that was one of the first to use computer simulation to predict chemical reactions. And then this one, Scriptulate, which is focused on collecting information in a meaningful way for doctors. And it's information that's available. It's just very hard for a doctor to collect it in a busy workday. So in that sense, it's a simple solution. But those are maybe the 3 companies, even though they aren't necessarily the ones that made me financially successful. I hope Scriptulate would be different about that, but they're the ones that I think I'll be most proudest of having been associated with, and I'd like to believe that there are areas where somebody who is competent at explaining fairly complex processes plays a critical role in the company. And I think that's going to be true more and more for finance professionals going forward.
Well, that's and I subscribe, and I couldn't agree more. So I think we're going to probably put all the links to your book, to your different, and for this startup as well, in the interview that is going to be distributed through our channels. I appreciate Randall for your time and for these great insights. I probably would just get the last, I want your opinion, the last one. So you mentioned that you are proud about these 3 companies, but from the experience with bringing a company from 0 to $1 billion or to $500 million, what would be the biggest as well takeaway for our audience? Because of course, success is about numbers as well, but it's about meaningful numbers. And I think I would like to have just one last remark on that.
Yeah, I would say it seems impressive, but I have to say it didn't feel that different in the middle of it, except I was busier and I suppose under more pressure. The one thing I would say about a company that grows that fast is that every person matters. That companies cannot do that unless they add critical and competent people and take advantage of their skills. And that's true across all of the functions. Other than that, as I look back, I'm not sure that the super high growth companies that I've worked for were that different than the companies that didn't turn out that way. And that's something people should remember, and venture capitalists will say this all the time, is that they are more likely, many of them claim, I don't know if it's true, they're more likely to invest in an entrepreneur who's had his share of failures than someone who's had nothing but success.
That's a great way to remark this. So thank you so much, Randall. It's been a pleasure and an honor as well. And there's a lot of quotes I took from the interview and some of the things that our editorial team did. So we'll promote this and it'll be all over the internet. Thank you so much, Randall.
Dinis, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. It's a privilege for me to